I'm delighted to introduce Professor Julie Allen. Julie Allen is a professor of comparative literature here at BYU. She teaches our Danish literature courses as well, and recently completed a book on Danish silent film. And we're really delighted that she can introduce our speaker. I also want to mention that our speaker today is sponsored by Scandinavian Studies. The Bjarnson Fund that has been generously donated to support Scandinavian Studies at BYU is one of the sponsors of our lecture. Julie.
It's really a pleasure for me to have Lars-Martin Sørensen here at BYU. He's been a mentor of mine for many years since I was a very wet behind the ears young film researcher and came to the Danish Film Institute and was welcomed with open arms. And there's such a wealth of so many stories about Danish film that nobody knows, they don't know. But Lars-Martin tells a lot of those stories in his work and at the Danish Film Institute. He received his bachelor's degree in Japan studies, curiously enough, and an MA and Ph.D. in film and media studies from Copenhagen University. He's the author of many books, including Censorship of Japanese Films During the U.S. Occupation of Japan, Danish Film Under Nazism, and latest news from Berlin on how Danish Berlin correspondents reported the rise of Nazism. He's also a delightful person and a fabulous speaker of Danish. So anyone who wants to practice their Danish, I highly recommend chatting with Lars-Martin after the talk. So, Lars-Martin.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Julie. You're a fabulous speaker of Danish, yes you are. First of all, thank you very much, Professor Meckham and for Julie, to having invited me here. I'm delighted to be here, even though I did have to spend 22 hours in an airplane. Doing that somehow made me realize that maybe the Danes are not right when they all seem to claim unanimously that Denmark is the center of the world. So I thought my first slide to you here today would have to be a map to get us all situated just a little bit. So as you can see, we've got a map. That is Denmark. And that is a swastika, of course, and it's all burning. And it's for a film made in the post-war year called Denmark in Chains. It's, as it says, an authentic film from the 5 years of occupation that stretched from 1940 to 1945. Denmark was occupied by the German army. And the claim to authenticism can certainly be discussed, but we're not going to do that today. We're going to do something else. But I thought, if we start with a map, then you have to imagine that Germany's down here. Paris is sort of down here. Up here, you've got the Scandinavian countries. You've got Norway. You've got Sweden here. And Denmark is there in the middle. Great Britain here. We're in 1940. There's around 3.5 million people living there. Most of them in Copenhagen, which is there. And that's where I live too, or where I used to live. The talk I'm going to give piggybacks on these 3 publications. Julie has already mentioned them. My PhD thesis was on the censorship of Japanese films, U.S. occupation censorship of Japanese films from 1945 to 52. Then in 2015, I published this book, Danish Film Under Nazism. And then in 2019, this one. And that as Julie said, performs an analysis on how Danish Berlin correspondents reported the rise of Nazism to Danish newspaper readers. The idea behind that move was to sort of find out when people knew what. Because when you know when it dawned on the Danish population that Hitler's dictatorship in Germany was a violent one, then you can sort of begin to understand why people acted the way they did. Danish Film Under Nazism took a sort of a slice of Danish film history from around 1920 to 1950-ish and analyzed it on the basis of a number of documents that were really hard to find. I'm going to show you how hard they were to find in just a moment. But the censorship of Japanese films during the occupation of Japan was sort of my first move into studies of authoritarianism and resistance. And if we take a look at the Japanese situation first, you had American troops landing in Japan in fall 1945, and they set up a system of guidance and censorship. Two government agencies, the CIA and the CCD, CIA Civil Information and Education Section, guided Japanese filmmakers on what topics they should do films on, and the CCD, the Civil Censorship Detachment, made sure they didn't expose anything in their films that was anti-democratic, anti-American. One of the things that American censors tried to root out was feudalism, feudal thinking, militarist thinking, and chauvinist thinking in Japanese films. In a way, the American occupation authorities in Japan in this period tried to democratize Japan through censorship, which I think is perhaps a paradox. But nevertheless, that was the project. What I found in this book was that there were very deep cultural differences between the Japanese and the American occupiers. The Japanese language lends itself perfectly to punning. So there were many ways in which the Japanese could say things amongst themselves that the watchful Americans had no chance of understanding. Just to give you one brief example, you know, Japanese religion, nativist religion, is called Shintoism, and they pray to the kami, the spirits which can also be their ancestors. Now, a kami in Japanese, the word kami can also mean paper, and it can mean hair. So in Shinto temples, you will find little pieces of paper hanging from trees, and in the center of the shrines, you will find locks of hair. But it's one example of a word that can take on a lot of different meanings, and this, of course, could be employed if Japanese filmmakers wanted to somehow criticize the modernization, forced modernization of their society, and they certainly did. How they did, you can read in this book. I'm not going to go into further detail. We're going to be talking about Danish matters, but I just wanted to highlight this because this is one thing that the Danes didn't have during the German occupation of Denmark. Danish and German are not that far from each other, those two languages, and a lot of Germans do understand and speak fluent Danish, so we couldn't really use punning as a means to criticize the German occupation of Denmark. Also, in Japan, there was a very strong production sector. And when you have a strong film production sector, you can take chances. There was around 100 million Japanese in 1945, and they did buy a lot of movie tickets. Therefore, you had a strong economy in the film business, and that is important. Because if you try to put forward resistance in a film, you take a big chance. That's the thing about films. You put in a lot of money into production first, and then that has to be recouped at the box office. Now, if you take chances with the content of a film and you put forward hidden or semi-concealed criticism of the powers, the ruling powers at the time, you take a chance of being censored and having your film nixed by censors. And then you have invested all the money and it's lost. Now, this is something you could not do in Denmark from 1940 to 45 when the Germans were there, because with 3.5 million people, you don't sell a lot of tickets. So films simply had to make money, and in order to make money, they had to pass through censorship. So that's a very different situation. I did find multiple cases of resistance and ambivalence in Japanese feature films, especially those made by Akira Kurosawa and those made by Yasuhiro Ozu, two of that era's greatest directors, or probably two of the greatest film directors of all times, if you ask me. And I did find a lot of ambivalence, a lot of situations where meanings could be negotiated in either directions, and where something that was overly modern also at times seemed to be overly Americanized. And certainly I found a lot of outburst films, I named them, from 1952 when the Americans left Japan. All of a sudden the Japanese started making films about prostitution, the destitution after World War II and the aerial bombings, and the most important topic that all of a sudden was treated in Japanese feature films was, of course, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All of a sudden, you had films dealing with those topics, and they had been kept under lid while the American occupation was there. So all in all, you could say that there was a tug-of-war between the censors and the Japanese filmmakers, and all of this stuff is on file at the National Archives in Washington. So my first trip to the US ever went to the National Archives in Washington to dig into those archives, and it was fantastic. I wish Danish archives were as open and accessible as the American ones are. Now, will you do as I tell you? Yes, it will. The Danish situation, I'm going to press a few buttons here to get back to where I should have been. The Danish research material for doing a similar research project on Danish film is right here. This happened on the 5th of May, 1945. A crowd of celebrating Danes looted the office of the German film company UFA in Copenhagen, took all their files, threw them out the window into a big heap in the street, and set it on fire. Now, that's the kind of thing you do when you're really happy you've been liberated after 5 years of occupation. For a film historian, that right there is nothing to celebrate. That is a nightmare. I have live footage of those files burning. But it happened, and I guess you can't really blame the people that did it. Fortunately, and this is where I'd like us to see the first film clip, if you can fix that from the projection room. Fortunately, a group of young men called the Group 1944, that's what they called themselves, in April 44, risked their lives doing a resistance action against the German Chamber of Commerce in the center of Copenhagen. And hopefully, you will see them right. That is illegal recordings from April 1944 at Nørreport in Copenhagen. They've got a camera in a first-story flat pointing towards, that's the entrance to the German Chamber of Commerce. And as you can see, this was not meant for screening. This was meant to document what they'd actually done. Look at those guys with the long coats. And there's a guy waiting in the entrance. Here they could enter the German Chamber of Commerce. They're all armed to the teeth. Now they go up to the second floor and they do a hold-up of the German staff there. And over the next 3 hours, they steal more than 500,000 documents. Here's the first load. Loaded onto a bicycle. Isn't that something? These guys are my heroes. I dedicated the book to the leader of this group. He was shot and killed only 2 weeks after this action took place. Here's the second load. The third one, I think they realized there were so many documents that they wanted, so they had to steal a car. And they stole one from a removal company called Adolf. What a coincidence, right? So they stole 500,000 documents, and this was stored in our National Archives. You can stop the film now, please, and go back to the presentation. And that's where I found it. And I found this film in the Danish Film Institute's own archive, and I thought, wow, fantastic. Just to give you one example of what they were found at the German Chamber of Commerce is this document. This is the leader of UFA film in Copenhagen, von Hake. He's a real stereotypical plastic Nazi with steel glasses and leather coat. It is his verdict on a number of films by the Danish production company Nordisk Film. And here you have the film title, The Golden Smile, in German, made by Nordisk Film Company, the largest production company, directed by Paul Fios. It had Bodil Jørgensen and Carl Alstrup as actors, and here's the verdict. Not suitable for export. Actor Samuel Besekov, a communist Jew, Director Paul Fires, probably a Hungarian Jew, manuscript by Kai Munk, a very anti-German person. So this is the German film company's list of films that were suitable for export to Germany or unsuitable. That's the kind of stuff I found. So I'm very grateful to these guys for having provided me with source material. Now, the situation in Denmark from 40 to 45 didn't come around sort of out of the blue. There was a historical background, of course, and people reacted under influence of the background. So looking a bit back to the 1930s to understand the frame of mind of the Danish film business and the people around, the audience and so on is useful. You have this situation where already by the 1920s, the Danish film business starts taking precautions not to offend German diplomats in Copenhagen. We normally think about Weimar, Berlin and Germany as a period of liberal democracy and so on. It wasn't. Not to a very small neighboring country. This poster here is from a film that was made in 1926-27 called Grænsefolket, the people of the borderland, and it deals with the fate of Danes in the southern part of the peninsula Jutland, which was under German rule until 1920. Here you can see the Germans coming around the corner. These are Prussians, and they're not really welcome. Well, they're not in this particular film, and it was produced and banned on the day when it was supposed to open in the theaters because German diplomats in Copenhagen had objected to its screening. So already by the 1920s, the Danish film business and Danish film censors were being very careful not to offend German sensitivities. This pressure from Germany was radicalized and became heavier and heavier up through the 1930s, where newspapers were told by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for instance, to steer a course of neutralism. Denmark was a neutral country. Do not take part in discussions as to whether or not Hitler is a good or a bad guy. I mean, that was the instruction they got. And if you do, we will censor you. So it was kind of, giving sort of very stern advice to Danish publishers on what and what not to write on. This pressure manifests itself on these three levels that I've listed here, an individual level. How do people react to cultural pressure? Up through the 1930s, Nazi German newsreels were beginning to be screened in Danish cinemas. So all of a sudden you could see Hitler and his cohorts marching, and you could see the German soldiers in thousands marching and doing their thing, and not everyone in Denmark thought that this was fine and hunky-dory, and I'm sure that a lot of Danes felt that this could eventually become very dangerous. So people would start protesting at Danish cinemas, shouting at what was going on, and then there was unrest. And the Germans caught the whiff of this, and in the end, these newsreels, or every screening in Danish cinemas, started with an on-screen proclamation saying, "Keep your mouth shut, stay neutral. We will not accept jeering at what goes on screen." So that was sort of what happened at the individual level. What did the companies do? Well, the Danish film producing companies thought it was a business opportunity that Germany all of a sudden started becoming a dynamo in an economic dynamo. Germany had a huge market, 40, 50 million people. You could export films to them. We did in the silent era, where Danish film production companies made a lot of money, a ton of money, exporting films to Germany. So Danish companies sort of thought this could be good, and started trying to export Danish films to Germany. And then, of course, there was the Danish government as the official level, where, as I've already said, most politicians wanted to steer a course of neutralism. Now, all this also led to state intervention in film policies. And that was not just because of the rise of fascism in Germany, but also because of the dominance of Hollywood films flowing into Denmark. Already by the early 30s, Danish authorities were putting up government agencies that was supposed to produce and distribute films for educational purposes. So these organizations were in place when the Germans invaded in 1940. It falls asleep, this thing. We'll try again. Can you change the slide from up there? Because this seems to be out of battery or something. Here we are. Just a brief look at the four major companies in the Danish film trade in 1940. John Olsen over here, a distributor. Tage Nielsen, another film distributor. Carl Bauder in the middle, head of Nordisk Film. 2 weeks after the Germans had invaded the country, he was in Berlin negotiating with the Germans on how to distribute film to all of Scandinavia. Over there on the left, the three top figures of Asa Film, which was the most recent company established in Denmark in 1936, I believe it was. Also those who collaborated most eagerly. These are the film companies that made most of their money making fiction features. A few snapshots from April 1940, 2 weeks after German troops rolled over the southern border and occupied Denmark, went on to Norway, where they met with quite a bit more resistance from Norwegian soldiers than they did in Denmark. You see Carl Bauder, the CEO of the largest Danish film producing company in Warnemünde, Germany. Behind him is this guy, who is a German living in Denmark called Heinz Graf. He's a member of the German Nazi Party. He has recently been upped to the position of head of Nordisk Film's lab, not because he knows anything about film, but because he's got good connections in Berlin. Here you see him with a few of his fellow countrymen, German soldiers. He borrowed a steel hat. This guy over here is head of the German Nazi Party in Denmark, and he's now on the board of Nordisk Film, the largest producing company. So these guys met the invasion with an instant reaction: collaborate, 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 make money. Now is the time to get good business connections with Germany. I brought this picture too, because here again is Carl Bauder, the head of Nordisk Film, and I can't really figure out whether that is a Nazi greeting or he's just waving. Is he going or is he going I don't know. But I'll leave that to you for you to decide. This invasion of Denmark was coupled with an attempt from the Germans to infuse Nazi culture into every nook and cranny of Danish society. Not only did they want their propagandistic newsreels screened for every screening of films in Denmark, they also distributed magazines. The Danish Nazi Party had its own newspaper, and so on and so forth. So from day one, the occupiers were trying to expose, distribute Nazi propaganda in Denmark, both for ideological and for economical reasons. There's money to be made, and they needed money. As already mentioned, the Nazi newsreels were the most controversial parts of this propaganda offensive. Danish newsreels at the time were sort of elbowed out by the Germans, so they could control or monopolize the market for newsreel screenings in Denmark. And by fall 1940, British films had been banned. American films were no longer imported into Denmark because of the war at sea. They were not banned officially, but new films didn't come to Denmark, so they kept recycling old American films till they literally fell apart in the projection room because they'd been screened so many times. And amongst Danish in the Danish film trade, some people started voicing this opinion that we should start producing short informational films that could substitute the German newsreels that were being screened in cinema programs prior to the screening of the feature, which was of course the main attraction of the film program. You would have you would enter, you'd buy a ticket, go to the movie house, and there would be screening of a couple of shorts, maybe ads first, then a newsreel or an informational short film, and then the feature. That would sort of be the standard program. And when there was no Danish films to screen prior to the screening of feature films, it was easy for the Germans to make the cinema owners take German newsreels and screen them. The American alternative, short films with Popeye and Betty Boop, didn't come to Denmark anymore, so there was a lack of these short films that accompanied the feature. So Danish cinema owners were saying, we should have our own production of short informational films that can substitute the German propaganda films. And it was one cinema owner who put in a sort of an open-ed column in a trade magazine it was on November or December 1940. And after that, it took 2 months, and then the government agencies had all of a sudden 100,000 Danish kroners ready for the production of short informational films. And it looks too crazy a coincidence to be one. I mean, this has to have been agreed on beforehand, because you simply don't get money for film production that fast in Denmark if people haven't been talking behind the scenes that we've got to do something to elbow out these Nazi newsreels. So from spring 1941, first the Employment Film Committee launches a production of informational shorts. At first, they're quite ambivalent films. Some of them deals with, for instance, peat production, as you can see down here. Peat production was a big thing. You couldn't get oil, you couldn't get coal because of the war at sea. So the Danes started digging peat to have something to heat their homes. They also dug a lot of peat in the Baltic countries, where the head of this Employment Film Committee, he was an industrial magnate, had plants, and these plants had been taken over by the Russians when they invaded Poland, and they'd lost all their subsidiaries in the Baltic countries. But now Germany, from summer of 41, when Germany invaded Russia, this guy who was the head of this committee could see an advantage in making informational films about peat production, because they could be used by the Germans in the Baltic countries to get these peat plants back on track in the Baltic. So at first, these films served the purpose of collaboration with the Germans. Then, gradually, this changed. This guy, who was the head of the film committee, was no longer in charge from 44, and gradually these short informational films became films that glorified all things Danish, you could say. Glorified the Danish social systems, the welfare state. You may not know, but by 1933 we had a big political reform in Denmark, and that entitled every Dane to the right of free holidays, unemployment benefits. What do you call it? You call it Medicare in the States. We had that from 1933, paid by the state. Then again, we pay 50-60% tax, which I guess you don't. So there you are. But all these things about the Danish system of the social state or the welfare state were made the topics of short films that were then screened in cinemas. Also, the recalibration of Danish production to wartime conditions, the recycling of metal, traffic safety could become a topic of these short informational films. And they were all counter-narratives, in the sense that the initial impetus to start this production was to elbow out the German Nazi newsreels. I put a term up here called situated meaning, because when you look at these films today, they all seem sort of romanticizing the Danish past, telling everyone how fabulous government systems for recycling, for instance, is. But at the time, they were the only alternative to the Nazi newsreels that were glorifying the German victories in the battlefields. So, in subject matter and just the fact that they existed was actually resistance at a government level, you could say. As I've already said, they were targeted at both Danish and German audiences. Some of those films could be used for educational and informational purposes in Germany, and we have found them in our archives with German dubs or German subtitles. Some of them promote Danish industries, industrial goods. We sold a lot of horses, for instance, to Germany, and there are brilliant films on how Danish horses are born and bred in Denmark from this period. And it just goes to show that when you do make film, it's a very flexible medium. You just put on new subtitles, and the meaning a film can take on is entirely different, and can be used for opposite purposes. But what happened during those years was that from having no documentary film movement at all of a sudden a generation of young documentarists grew up, honed their skills making these state informational shorts. And they became very, very good at it. And they were all, not all, but nearly all of them were leftists, and they were part of the resistance film group. So during the daytime or during official work hours, they could be in the streets shooting footage for informational shorts, maybe even go to places where taking photos or shooting film was not allowed. For strategic purposes of military installations and so on and so forth. And if they got caught by the police, they could say, "Hey, look, we're doing this for the Danish government. We are acting with impunity here." But maybe they were not. Maybe they were making shooting footage to be used to tell the world about conditions in occupied Denmark. Here you got two frame grabs from two films that are both on YouTube, so you can go and watch them. Short informational films that made in 1944, Denmark Fights for Freedom, is the form of an American newsreel of the time. It tells how the Huns are mistreating the poor Danes, and this is the opening frame. We cannot tell the full story until after liberation, but the following scenes, taken under the most dangerous conditions and smuggled out of the country, give a brief glimpse of events in Denmark today. And then you get sort of an introduction to the wartime situation in Denmark and how these brave Danes fight the terrible Huns and make sabotage against installations that produce stuff for the German army and so on and so forth. A lot of the footage that goes into these films have been shot illegally, like the clip I showed you just a minute ago. This one down here is from Fighting Denmark, which was made in late 43. It's got a Danish voiceover, so it's not that useful to you. But the other one, Denmark Fights for Freedom, has got an English speak, so you can see that. This is from one clip to the next. This is the castle in the Tivoli Gardens in central Copenhagen, and this is how it looked when the Danish Nazi collaborators blew it all up in spring 1944. So that kind of stuff was smuggled out of Denmark, and it was done by the same young documentarists who were doing state informational shorts as a professional occupation. Now, in spring 1945, Denmark was liberated, and it came to a race between these young filmmakers on producing the first feature-length documentary on the German occupation of Denmark. Now, as I've already said, one of the films was called Denmark in Chains. It came out already in fall 1945. The next one out was in spring 1946. Your Freedom is at Stake, it was called. And then in 1955, They sort of rejuggled the footage they'd shot during the occupation and made the 5 years. This is a British Royal Air Force bomber plane throwing down containers with guns and explosives for the Danish resistance, and of course they lit a bonfire for the bomber plane to be able to see where to drop the stuff, right? This was one of the really dangerous things they did in the Danish resistance during the war years, was making sure to get British and American weapons into Denmark. Now, allegedly, they had 110 kilometers of illegal footage that they'd shot during the war years that was then employed to make these 3 very different films. So you could say that the German propaganda offensive to inject their Nazi cultural newsreels and propaganda into Danish movie houses first resulted in resistance at an official level. The Danish government financed a production of roughly counting 90 informational shorts during the 4 years of occupation, films that were glorifying the Danish past, telling about the blessings of Danish society, and doing it in order to elbow out Nazi propaganda. At the same time, this first generation of Danish documentarists honed their skills doing these informational shorts, and in their spare time shot illegal footage that was then used to tell the story of German oppression after the war. So in every possible way, Joseph Goebbels, the German Minister of Propaganda, got exactly the opposite of what he bargained for. And I think as an authoritarian, he would have been pretty discontented if he had lived long enough to realize that this was actually what happened. I'm going to thank you for your attention. I'm going to show a brief clip because we've got time to see one of the instances of open resistance in one of the state informational shorts. But this final clip, just to show you the RAF hats, they're not Jewish hats, they're little hats indicating resistance, the colors of the British Royal Air Force. And here's a brief clip from a film called The Grain is in Danger. Now, I'm going to be talking as we play it, even though there's a voiceover, because not that many of you do understand Danish, I presume. So just run the clip, please. What you're hearing here is little beetles, vermin that destroy the Danish harvest. And they go snudebiller, that means granary weevils. From their home place in India, they have invaded the entire world. They pillage and plunder, eat and destroy. And they force their way into every nook and cranny. Okay, you can stop the clip now. They're not talking about beetles. This is a fully fledged, from the start to the end, this is a fully fledged allegory on how German occupation troops are ruining the Danish harvest, penetrating every nook and cranny of Danish society. And what makes it stand out as in every way opposed to the German propaganda films of this period is the very humoristic way the voiceover has been made. The Beatles have been given a voice, and they said, this is nice and warm. And it's all done in this very informal, folksy kind of way of telling the story. And at the same time, you've got these Beatles crawling all over the map, like German soldiers invading all of Europe. So that short clip from The Grain is in Danger employs a trick that I also found in Japan, where they made informational films about American caterpillars. In Eastern Germany, they had, during the Russian occupation just after the war, they had a film on some kind of Russian vermin that was destroying the German harvest. So this little trick denouncing your opponent or your oppressor as vermin seems to be completely universal. Okay, thanks for your attention. Let's have some questions and some comments.
Thank you so much. That was really informative. We will go until 1 p.m. today. So if you need to step out for a class that starts at 1, you're welcome to do that as you need to. But we would love to invite you into a discussion with our speaker. The way we will do that is if you have a question you'd like to raise, just raise your hand. We have some students that are going to bring you a microphone. Once you receive the microphone, just please stand, tell us who you are. If you're a student, tell us what you study here at BYU, and we'll go until 1 p.m. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Lily Knutson, and I'm a film major here. I was curious, is the best place to watch these clips and everything, is it YouTube, or is it going through institutions specifically so that we could see more of this kind of stuff?
Most of the stuff you've seen here, or the last film you've seen here, is on a streaming site run by the Danish Film Institute called Denmark on Film. But you have to write that in Danish in order to find it. So if you drop me an email, I'll send you a link. And my email address is Lars with 2 S's @dfi.dk. We put around 3,000 shorts online, and they can be streamed globally. And a lot of this stuff is on there because the Danish Film Institute holds the rights to these government-sponsored films. So it's wonderful. We have got our film history online.
Hi, my name is Mary Hedingren. I'm an instructor in the writing program, and I thought this was a great lecture about Danish filmmakers' relationship with Germany during and after the occupation. But I was a little curious if you could speak a little bit about Danish filmmakers' relationship to their other neighbors in neutral Sweden during and before the occupation.
Yes, I certainly can. Denmark and Sweden were also always sort of communicating vessels in terms of film industries. There's a lot of traffic across the Sound, actors, directors going here and there. You had quite a few Swedish actors in Danish film already, but in the silent era. The most renowned Danish director ever, Carl Theodor Dreyer, directed a feature in Sweden in the 1920s. So there was a lot of traffic between those two countries. Language differences are easily overcome, or at least they used to be. It's not like that anymore because most youngsters prefer to speak English instead of learning how to understand and speak Swedish these days, due to the internet, of course. It's a different matter with Norway, really, because Norway never really had a big film industry. Sweden had a big film industry already by the 1920s with Greta Garbo, Sjöström, and Stiller, if you know these directors. So the exchange was easy to establish between the Danish and the Swedish film industry. Whereas Norway, no, they didn't have a film industry till after World War II, and nothing to speak of, really. Hope that answers your question. If not, ask me again.
Hi, my name's Chip Oscarson. I teach here actually in Scandinavian studies and in film, a little bit more from the Swedish angle. But my question, you mentioned Carl Theodor Dreyer, and your presentation got me thinking about his film Day of Wrath,
yes,
which came out in 1943, made in Denmark. And it's always just been baffling to me that it wasn't banned, because it is so obviously kind of an allegory. I mean, it's working on several levels, but it's so much an allegory about it seems to me, about the occupation. And I understand he had to flee Denmark after it finally came out, but it was screened in Denmark. And it leads me to just wonder, like, what was going on with the German censors that they weren't kind of more bothered by this film and kind of how it connects to what you're talking about here.
This is really an intriguing question, and to those of you who don't know what Day of Wrath is about, it is a film on the witch hunts of the Middle Ages, and making a film witch hunts in Denmark in 1943, where the Germans were trying to round up the Danish Jews and send them to concentration camp, obviously from the very start would be a controversial thing to do. I've discussed this with a colleague of mine called Kasper Tybjerg. He's an associate professor at Copenhagen University, and he is the leading Dreyer expert in the world. And I think I should refer to him, and he always says, they didn't get it. The Germans in Copenhagen didn't get it. There's a review of Day of Wrath in a publication called Copenhagener Soldaterzeitung. That is the Copenhagen's German soldiers' newspaper, a German language paper published in occupied Copenhagen for the German troops. And this review of Day of Wrath it's a celebration from the first line to the last one of the film as a wonderful work of art. Dreyer himself has never said anything there are no quotes from him as to whether he intended it to be an allegory or not, to be understood in an allegorical fashion or not. Surely, as a very sort of knowing film director, this wasn't a meaning making that he must bargain for. I mean, thinking otherwise, I think is naive. But he never said so. And the Germans surely didn't think so. Then there's a snag. Dreyer fled Denmark after the opening of the film and went to neutral Sweden and stayed there for the rest of the war. So, what do you know? It's hard to disentangle the different elements here. But I think we can safely say that the Germans didn't get it. Otherwise, it wouldn't have opened. And then we have to keep in mind that film censorship was actually not entirely German. Film censorship was Danish, but it was overseen by German supervisors. So that again is not black or white, but grayish, right?
Hi, I can just talk loud. Rob McFarland, I teach German Scandinavian cinema with Chip. I'm interested in that last clip you saw, and have you made any connection between that and Der ewige Jude,
Yes.
the eternal Jew, where you have the maps and the rats flying
Yes.
all over different places? It seems like the Nazis themselves were the ones who
Yes.
kind of propagated that imagery. I'm not as sure first, but
I have, and that again is we're sort of on thin ice because the ewige Jude was not screened in Denmark during the occupation. That doesn't mean to say that Danish filmmakers didn't see it, but they would have had to at least have heard about those shots because it's an exact copy of the wandering Jew, the rats running over the map, as you say. And I made that inference immediately when I first saw this film. But whether or not the director who put this stuff together had seen the ewige Jude or not is an open question. But I guess he must have.
Hi, I'm Camille. I'm studying bioinformatics, but I was wondering, you talked about how subtitles and the language dubbing over these films could be very powerful. And so I just wanted to know your research and studies about how the resistance was able to use subtitles and language dubbing to fight the Germans, basically.
Well, in 1943, the Germans got the idea that there was a need for social reforms in Denmark. And the Minister of Interior commissioned a film called Det sociale Gesicht Dänemarks, the social face of Denmark. This film sort of took you on a trip through all the different institutions. As I mentioned, the paid summer holidays for Danish workers, the welfare programs for elderly, the unemployment for the unemployed, the healthcare and all this stuff, and said we really don't need social reform in Denmark. And this is all rooted in our culture, which goes back to the Dark Ages, and we have our own Führer, by the way. It's the king, you know. So we really don't need German reforms in occupied Denmark. This film stipulates. exactly the same footage was then, this stuff was made in German, and the Danish Minister of Interior brought it to Germany and had it screened in Berlin as a sort of reply to this pressure from Germany to make Nazi political reforms of social systems in Denmark. Exactly the same footage was then dubbed with another dub, and it was called Det Sociale Danmark, the Danish title was. And it's an entirely different story. It is a story of how people come together in a democracy that is sort of characterized by dialogue, sometimes squabbling, how unionization of workers and so on have led to these societal reforms that have been agreed by politicians and consensus and are supported by the broad public, and still leaves quite a bit to be desired. So it's an entirely different story, the Danish film. And I'm telling you, there's no difference. There's not one clip in the one film that's not in the other, but just tells two entirely different stories. It's a wonderful example of how you can format the meaning making with the voiceover. Unfortunately, it's not online, and you don't speak Danish or German anyhow. So, but now you know. Yeah. We've got time for a question more. Yeah.
I'll ask one, and I'll also do what Rob did here. Can you provide a little bit more context as to what cinema goers were watching generally in feature-length films during this period of time? When did they go to the cinema? What were the films that were available? And why did we see particular storylines and genres in this period in the Danish theaters?
I can. Until the outbreak of war in 1940, around 80% of what was screened in Danish movie houses was American films. Then, as I said, they stopped coming because of the war. And we all of a sudden had this mixture of German films, of French films, Italian films, a lot of reruns of old Danish films. And as everywhere else, this was entertainment for the common man. Going to the movie house was a cheap way of finding entertainment. And what happened with the outbreak of war in Denmark was that there was scarcity on a lot of goods. I mean, there was a lot of stuff you couldn't get, you couldn't buy, you couldn't spend your money buying nylon stockings because they were not in shops any longer. So you had to spend your money one way or the other. You could either get drunk or you could go to the cinema. So cinemas were booming, and most people, I think, went to the cinema once or twice a week to see these films. And obviously that provided an opportunity to anyone who would like to disseminate propaganda, to influence people, that you had this window. And I think that winning the hearts and minds of occupied moviegoers has sort of been an exercise that was undertaken during the German occupation of Denmark, as well as in the American occupation of Japan, with very varying success, you could say. Then again, you should never overestimate the extent to which people take down political messages from something that is meant for entertainment. The most successful German film in Danish cinemas during the occupation was Die Goldene Stadt, which came out in 42, 43, at a point in time where those who had been in favor of the Germans, even though they had occupied Denmark, had realized that no, they're not going to win this war, and it's time to change sides if you want to be on the right side of history. But nevertheless, this film went for eight weeks or so in one of the largest cinemas in Copenhagen, because it was a good film, and it was a color film, which was a new thing. So saying that audiences are always ideologically aware of what they're watching and buying tickets accordingly would be overstating it. People go for the education, a good night out, and perhaps the film is German and infused with Nazi ideology, and so what? I can resist that. I don't become a Nazi by watching it. You know, that kind of audience also exists. So, yeah.
All right, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your attendance and hope you have a great day. Thank you once again.
Thank you all for coming. And thanks for